Now we will go through the tracts of the spinal cord. Now I told you there are two types of tracts are there, ascending tracts and descending tracts. The sensory information from the receptors throughout the most of the body is relayed to the brain by means of ascending tracts fibers that conducts the impulses up to the spinal cord. So from outside the body, the sensory information, once it reaches the spinal cord, it passed through these ascending tracts and reaches the brain. When the brain directs the motor activities, these directions from the central nervous system or brain, it forms the nerve impulses and travel down through the spinal cord through the tracts only. So it travels down the spinal spinal cord through the descending tracts. Ascending tracts are the tracts which carry signals in the spinal cord. Typically, types of neurons are available in the ascending tracts. The first order, there are first order neuron, there are second order neuron, there are third order neuron. First order neuron, it detects the stimulus and carries into the spinal cord. So first there are first order neuron, it detects the stimulus and carries into the spinal cord. Second order neuron is seen within the spinal cord. It is continuous to the thalamus, to the sensory, that is, thalamus is the sensory relay station. So second order neuron in the spinal cord carries to the thalamus. Then third order neuron, it carries signals from thalamus to the sensory region of the cerebral cortex. So once you say the ascending tracts, the prefix will be spino. For example, the spinothalamic tract or spino-reticular tracts, spinocerebellar tracts. The tracts which prefix spino means these are the ascending tracts. So it's having three neurons, a first order neuron that is detect the impulse and carries impulse stimulus and carries to the spinal cord. Second order neuron, it is in the spinal cord and it reaches till the thalamus, and a third order neuron which carries signal from thalamus to the sensory region of the cerebral cortex. Now, which are the ascending tracts? These are dorsal column tract, spinothalamic tract, spinoreticular tract, and spinocerebellar tracts are the ascending tracts. So, dorsal column tract, dorsal spinothalamic tract, spinoreticular tract, and spinocerebellar tracts are the descending tracts, ascending tracts. Then descending tracts are the motor tracts. These are pyramidal tracts. These can be divided into pyramidal tracts and extrapyramidal tract. Pyramidal tract include lateral corticospinal and anterior corticospinal tract. Then extrapyramidal tract includes rubrospinal tract, reticulospinal tract, olivospinal tract, and vestibulospinal tract. So we were discussing about the ascending tracts. The first ascending tract is the dorsal column tract. Dorsal column tract is a tract which carries sensations related to the discriminative touch, visceral pain, vibration, and proprioception. Discriminative touch, visceral pain, vibration, and proprioception is carried through dorsal column tract to the brain. Now, it's having again three neurons. The first order neuron. First order neuron, it detects the stimulus. There is fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus is there. Fasciculus gracilis carries sensation from below T6 and fasciculus cuneatus carries sensation from T6 or higher level. And there is second order neuron. It synapses with the first order neuron in the medulla and it deposits. Then the third order, it travels up and the third order neuron synapses with the second order neuron at the thalamus and carries signals to the cerebral cortex, that is at the post-central gyrus. The system, it's a contralateral system. So, this is the dorsal column tract. It is a tract which carries sensation of discriminative touch, visceral pain, proprioception and vibration. Next type of ascending tract is the spinothalamic tract or spinothalamic pathway. Now, spinothalamic pathway is the pathway or tract which carries sensation of pain, pressure, temperature, light touch, tickle and itch. It is located in the anterior and lateral columns. Then deposition of the second order neuron occurs in the spinal cord, and third order neuron arise again at the thalamus level and continue to the cerebral cortex of the post-central gyrus. So, second, the ascending tract is the spinothalamic tract. Next, we have the spinoreticular tract, especially it carries the pain signal from a tissue injury site. So, the deficit in the spinal cord and ascend with the spinothalamic fibers and end with reticular formation. Third and fourth order neurons are it continue to the thalamus and cerebral cortex. So, there are third and fourth order neurons are present in the spinoreticular tract. Next ascending tract is the spinocerebellar tract. In the spinocerebellar tract, the first order neuron originate in the muscles and tendon. The second order neuron ascend in the ipsilateral lateral column, and it terminate in the cerebellum and it transmit proprioceptive signals from the limbs and the trunk. So, spinocerebellar tracts for the transmission of proprioceptive signals from the limbs and trunk. So, these were the ascending tracts or the sensory tracts. Now, there are descending tracts, especially motor tracts. So, there are two types of descending tracts are there. These are a direct pathway and indirect pathway. Direct pathway, that is called pyramidal tract, and indirect pathway, it is called extrapyramidal tract. Now, this motor pathway or descending tracts include two types of neuron. There is upper motor neuron and the lower motor neuron. Upper motor neuron begins with the soma in the cerebral cortex or brainstem, and lower motor neuron that is in the soma in the anterior horn axon leads to the muscle. Now, we can divide the tracts into two types, the descending tracts into two types, that is pyramidal tracts or pyramidal system. It's also called corticospinal tracts, and an extrapyramidal system. Now, we will discuss about the pyramidal system or corticospinal tract. These are the direct system, direct pathways which originate from the pyramidal neurons in the percental gyri in the brain. Now, pyramidal neuron is in the upper motor neuron, and it forms the corticospinal tracts. The upper motor neuron synapses in the anterior horn with the lower motor neuron. Then this lower motor neuron activates the skeletal muscles. This direct pathway regulates fast and fine skill movements. That is, this fast movement and skilled movement is directed by the pyramidal tract. Now, there are two types of pyramidal tracts are there. There are two parts are there. There is a lateral corticospinal tract and anterior corticospinal tract. In lateral corticospinal tract, upper motor neuron deposits in the pyramids of the medulla, and in the anterior corticospinal tract, upper motor neuron deposits at the spinal cord level. Now, there are some other descending system other than the pyramidal system. These are called extrapyramidal system. Now, its upper motor neuron originates in nuclei deep in the cerebrum, and upper motor neuron does not pass through the pyramids, and lower motor neuron is in the anterior horn of the motor neuron. It is at the lower motor neuron is an anterior horn motor neuron, and this system includes the indirect system or extrapyramidal system includes rubrospinal tract, vestibulospinal tract, reticulospinal tract and tectospinal tract. So, these are not like pyramidal system, this in the extrapyramidal system is multisynaptic. Now, the different extrapyramidal system we already named it: tectospinal tract, reticulospinal tract, vestibulospinal tracts and rubrospinal tract. Tectospinal tract, the reflex, it produces the reflex turning of the head in response to the sight and sound. Reticulospinal tract, its function is it controls the limb movement. Important to maintain the it is important to maintain the posture and balance. So, reticular spinal tract controls the limb movements. So, it's important to maintain the posture and balance. Next is the vestibulospinal tract, that is especially its main function is postural muscle activity, that is control. And rubrospinal tract, it originates from the red nucleus of the midbrain and it controls the flexor muscles. Now, we will be discussing about the spinal nerves. So, we already discussed is that spinal nerve is a part of the peripheral nervous system. There are 31 pairs of the spinal nerve, that is 8 at the cervical level, 12 at the thoracic level, 5 at lumbar level, 5 at sacral level and 1 at coccygeal level. Now, how the spinal nerves are formed? Each spinal nerve is formed by the union of the anterior and posterior roots in the intervertebral foramen. Now, the anterior root, it contains the motor fibers for the skeletal muscle. Those from the T1 to T. So, anterior root, it contains the motor fibers for the skeletal muscle. Those from T1 to L2 contain sympathetic fibers. S2 and S4 contain parasympathetic fibers. Posterior root contain the sensory fibers whose cell bodies are in the spinal ganglion. So, it is formed from the posterior and anterior root. The spinal nerves are formed from anterior and posterior root. Now, once we see the functional component, we can see there are 4 functional components are there for the spinal nerves. There is a somatic efferent nerve fiber is there. There is a visceral efferent nerve fiber is there. Somatic efferent nerve fiber is there and visceral efferent nerve fiber is there. Somatic efferent nerve fiber is the fibers that transmit motor impulse from spinal cord to the skeletal muscle. Visceral efferent nerve fiber is fiber that transmit the motor impulse from spinal cord to the smooth muscle, cardiac muscle or glands. These are the visceral efferent nerve fiber. So, efferent is just opposite of that. That is, somatic efferent nerve fiber means the fibers that transmit exteroceptive and proprioceptive impulse, that is sensory impulse from body to the spinal cord. Visceral means the fibers that transmit impulses from viscera to the spinal cord. So, functionally it is having 4 components. Functionally a spinal nerve is having 4 components. These are the somatic efferent, visceral efferent, somatic efferent, visceral efferent. Now, what is a nerve plexus? We might have heard lots regarding the nerve plexus, like brachial plexus, like lumbar plexus, like cervical plexus. What is meant by nerve plexus? It is a complex interwoven network of the nerve. It is called nerve plexus. 3 large plexus are seen at the body. These are cervical plexus, brachial plexus and lumbosacral plexus. The lumbosacral plexus can be further divided into lumbar plexus, sacral plexus. So, nerve plexus means these are complex interwoven nerves. So, mainly 3 types of plexus are seen in the body: cervical plexus, brachial plexus and lumbosacral plexus. Now, we might have heard upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron. What is upper motor neuron or lower motor neuron? Upper motor neuron means the motor neurons that originate from the motor region of the cerebral cortex or brain stem and carry the motor information down to the final common pathway. That is, any motor neuron that are not directly responsible for stimulating the targeting muscle is known as upper motor neuron. And the motor neuron which directly responsible for stimulating the target muscle is known as lower motor neuron. So that is the difference between upper and lower motor neuron. Lower motor neuron means the motor neuron connecting the brainstem and spinal cord to the muscle fiber, bringing the nerve impulses from upper motor neuron to the muscle or from there to the muscle, to the central nervous system. A lower motor neuron axon terminates at the muscle. So, a motor neuron's axon terminates at the muscle, it's called lower motor neuron, and which is not in contact with the effector muscle, it's called upper motor neuron. Now, what is a motor unit? Motor unit can be defined as a single motor neuron and the group of muscle fibers it is innervated. So, all muscle fiber is in a single motor unit consists of the same muscle fiber type. Now, a single motor neuron and the muscle fibers supplied by this motor neuron is considered as a motor unit. Now, we discussed about the spinal cord. It's having lots of functions. So, there are lots of tracts passing through the spinal cord. So, it's having both motor and sensory tracts are passing through. What will happen once the spinal cord may get injured? Usually, the spinal cord may get damaged, usually during any trauma or any diseases or even during road traffic accidents. So, spinal cord injury is causes damage to the spinal cord and which result in loss of function of the spinal cord. So, both motor and may be chance of motor and sensory function may get affected. So, the frequent causes are the trauma and diseases. So, that spinal cord may get damaged, it causes loss of function completely and partially, that is both sensory and motor function may get affected because both motor and sensory pathway passes through the spinal cord. Now, what are the different types of spinal cord paralysis? Depending upon the location and extent of injury, the different forms of paralysis can occur. That is, once there is a spinal cord injury, sometimes it may cause paralysis. So, how much injury is there? What is the location of the injury? Then the paralysis may be different. Monoplegia means paralysis of one limb. Diplegia means paralysis of both upper or lower limbs. Paraplegia means paralysis of both lower limb. Hemiplegia means paralysis of upper limb, torso and lower limb of the one side of the body. So, if the paralysis on one side of the body, it's called hemiplegia. Quadriplegia means paralysis of all four limbs. Now, what will happen? What each will go through, what will happen if there is spinal cord injury at each level? If the injury is at the cervical level, at C1, between C1 and C3, all daily functions, all daily activities must be totally assisted. Breathing will be dependent on ventilator. Motorized wheelchair controlled by sip and puff or chin movement is required at this stage. Now, if the spinal cord injury is at C4 level, all the conditions will be almost same as that of C1 and C3, but breathing gets spared. That is, breathing can be done without a ventilator. Now, if the paralysis is at C5 level, there will be proper good head and neck shoulder movements as well as elbow flexion, but still electrical wheelchair is required and short distance with the support of some person he can move. Movement can be done. Now, if it is at C6 level, wrist extension movement will be good, but assistance needed for dressing, transition of the bed to the chair or car may be needed assistance. If C7 and C8 level is at the C7 and C8, all the hand movement will get spared. All the hand movement will get all hand movements, and ability to dress, eat, drive, do transfer, and do upper body washes. Now, if the paralysis at the thoracic level, that is even if at T1 and to T4, normal communication skills may be there. Help only be needed for heavy that is loading wheelchair into a car, etc. If it is T5 to T9, manual wheelchair can be done for everyday daily living and independent for personal care. And if it is at T10 to L1, partial paralysis of the lower body will be there. If it is between L2 and S5, some knee, hip and foot movements with possible slow, difficult walking with the assistance or aids. Only heavy home maintenance and hard cleaning will need assistance. Now the spinal cord injury, these we were discussing about the complete injuries, complete cut. Spinal cord injury may be complete or incomplete. So spinal cord syndrome can be classified either a complete or incomplete categories. Complete is characterized by complete loss of motor and sensory function below the level of traumatic lesion. Incomplete is characterized by different neurological findings, that is partial loss of sensor, partial loss of motor function below the lesion. So injury may be, the spinal cord injury may be partial or complete. So complete means all the motor function and sensory function will be below the level get affected, but incomplete some functions will be spared, and there will be partial loss of sensory or motor functions. Now central, will partial lesion, we will go through some partial lesion. So first one is a central cord lesion, usually involves in the cervical region. It usually results from the cervical hyperextension causing an ischemic injury to the central part of the cord. So central part of the cord get affected. So there will be motor weakness is present in the upper limb than lower limb. So as the central cord is get affected, in the central cord syndrome, there will be motor weakness will be more in the upper limb than the lower limb. Then patient more likely to lose the pain and temperature sensation than the proprioception. Patient may complain of burning feeling in the upper limbs, and more commonly seen in older patients with cervical arthritis and narrowing of the spinal cord. So central cord syndrome means the center part will get affected. So usually there will be upper limb will be affected than lower limb, and patients may complain of burning feeling in the upper limb, and they may lose pain and temperature, but proprioception may get spared. Next type of lesion is the Brown-Sequard lesion. In Brown-Sequard lesion, one side of the spinal cord, one half of the spinal cord may get affected. That is, Brown-Sequard syndrome may result from an injury only to only half of the spinal cord and is most noticed in cervical region again. Is usually a tumor or a trauma or inflammation may cause Brown-Sequard syndrome. So there will be motor loss is evident on the same side as the injury to the spinal cord. Sensory loss is evident on the opposite side, especially on the opposite side of the location. Then bowel and bladder will be normal. Person is normally able to walk through some bracing or a stability device may be required. The next one is the anterior spinal cord syndrome. It is usually result from a compression of the artery that runs along in front of the spinal cord. So compression of the spinal cord may form maybe from a bone fragment or a large herniation. Even a bone fragment or a disc herniation may cause compression of the anterior spinal cord syndrome. Patients with anterior spinal cord syndrome have a variable amount of motor function below the level of injury. Depends upon which area, which track is which side of the anterior side is get affected. Sensation to the pain and temperature also are lost, while the sensitivity to the vibration and proprioception are preserved. So these are the different types of the spinal cord paralysis, that is spinal cord injury. It may be a partial injury or a complete injury. That is partial injury is again central cord syndrome is the Brown-Séquard cord syndrome and anterior spinal cord syndrome. Now this session we discussed about the anatomy of the spinal cord, and it's regarding the covering, the meninges, and it's part of the meninges. We discussed about the spaces, and we discussed about the cerebrospinal fluid, how it is formed and how it is circulated, and we discussed about how about the anatomy of the spinal cord and regarding the gray matter. Then we discussed about the tracts of the spinal cord, including there are ascending tracts are there and descending tracts are there. Ascending tracts are the sensory tracts and descending tracts are the motor tracts. And there are spinal nerves are there and nerve plexus are there. And that's all. Diencephalon is the midline structure which is largely embedded in the cerebrum, and as it is embedded inside, it is hidden from the surface view. Now diencephalon is having two parts, a dorsal part and a ventral part. Dorsal part consists of thalamus, metathalamus and epithalamus. Dorsal part is having three parts again, that is thalamus, metathalamus and epithalamus. The ventral part consists of subthalamus and hypothalamus. So diencephalon can be divided into two parts, a dorsal part and a ventral part. The dorsal part consists of thalamus, metathalamus, epithalamus, ventral part, subthalamus and hypothalamus. Now we will be discussing about thalamus. Thalamus is a major station. It is a station where all impulses is transferred. It is all impulses relay through the thalamus. That is, it is a major station where all specific sensory impulses except smell relay before terminating into the cerebral cortex. Now, so even the cerebral cortex is damaged, crude sensory perception, for example like pain, remains present because thalamus acts as a crude center for sense of perception. So thalamus is a relay station, or it's a station where all the sensory impulses are transferred to the cerebral cortex. So even it acts as a crude center for especially the impulses like crude impulses like pain, because in case of even when the cerebral cortex is damaged, crude perception can remain intact because of the presence of thalamus. So thalamus's main function is it's a relay station between outside and the cerebral cortex. Now almost majority of the ascending impulses, non-specific ascending impulses from reticular activating system relay through the thalamus, through the thalamic nucleus, especially through the thalamic nuclei before it reaches to the cerebral cortex. And it's having intimate connection with the frontal cortex and hypothalamus. Thalamus is also involved in the feeling of personality and different emotions. So it's having connection with the hypothalamus and it's associated with the frontal cortex also. So it's having a role in the subjective feeling of personality and various other emotions. Next part is the hypothalamus. Now thalamus and hypothalamus together we can call it as diencephalon. it is seen at the, it is lies at the lateral wall of the third ventricle. Now, it can be considered as a head ganglion of the autonomic nervous system because it takes part in the control of many visceral and metabolic activities of the body. So, hypothalamus we can call it as a head ganglion or head of autonomic nervous system because it is having lots of visceral and metabolic functions. We will go through what are its different functions of thalamus, hypothalamus. So, different functions of hypothalamus. The first thing is that the most important function of hypothalamus is the endocrine control. It produces lots of inhibiting and releasing hormones, and by forming this releasing the releasing and inhibiting hormone, it regulates the anterior pituitary, especially it produces inhibiting and releasing hormone which control the endocrine functions of anterior pituitary. So, this hormone they are having, it produces releasing and inhibiting hormone. The releasing hormones are GHRH, that is growth hormone releasing hormone, TRH, that is thyrotropin releasing hormone, and GRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. So, it produces this endocrine control, it produces three types of hormones, three types of releasing hormones, that is growth hormone releasing hormone, thyrotropin releasing hormone, and gonadotropin releasing hormone. It produces two inhibitory hormones also. So, these are somatostatin, that is growth hormone inhibiting hormone, and prolactin inhibiting hormone. So, through this releasing and inhibiting hormone, this hypothalamus controls the anterior pituitary. So, growth hormone releasing hormone, thyrotropin releasing hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone, growth hormone inhibiting hormone, and prolactin inhibiting hormone are the hormones which releasing and inhibiting hormone or controlling hormones which is produced by hypothalamus. Now, instead of this, the other functions are, it can produce, it is having other endocrine functions like it can produce hormones also. The first one is it's having a function of neurosecretion. So, it produces oxytocin and vasopressin. These are the main hormones which is produced by hypothalamus. And after producing this oxytocin and vasopressin, it is released, it is transported to the posterior pituitary, and posterior pituitary it acts as only as a storage organ. So, hypothalamus produces the oxytocin and vasopressin, and it is stored in the posterior pituitary. Now, hypothalamus is having functions on the ANS, that is autonomic nervous system. That is especially the anterior part of the hypothalamus, it mediates the sympathetic activity. So, hypothalamus controls the autonomic nervous system. So, it can control the cardiovascular system, it can control the respiratory system, and it can control the elementary functions also. So, the hypothalamus is having the autonomic effect also. It controls the autonomic nervous system, it mediates the sympathetic activity. Now, the next function of hypothalamus is it's having temperature regulation function. So, there will be a balance between heat production and heat loss in the body. So, there are lots of mechanisms which controls the heat production and which controls the temperature of the body. So, once there is a raised temperature, it causes there will be vasodilatation and sweating. It gives the information for vasodilatation and sweating, and it controls the temperature. So, once there is vasodilatation, there will be the blood will be there will be more movement of the blood and the distribution of the heat at different parts of the body, and the body controls the heat. And next mechanism of heat control is sweating. And once there is a lowered temperature is there, so body itself, especially through mediated by hypothalamus, there will be vasoconstriction and there will be shivering. It also produces heat. So, temperature regulation is especially done by hypothalamus. So, it is by once there is a decrease in the heat, so it makes hypothalamus regulate, and it increase the vasoconstriction and shivering and produces more heat. And along with that, if there is an increased heat, if there is a raised heat, by doing vasodilatation and sweating, it controls or it depresses the heat. Now, next function of hypothalamus is the regulation of food and water intake. That is, there is a feeding center and a satiative center is there in the hypothalamus. The feeding center is situated laterally, and satiative center is situated in the medial side. So, for example, if there is stimulation of the feeding center, it causes hungry. So, the person may take more food. Or if there is a stimulation of satiative center, the person will feel like the person won't feel hungry, and there will be hyperphagia. And there will be hypophagia. If there is stimulation of the satiative center, there will be hypophagia. So, stimulation of the feeding center or the damage of the satiative center causes a hyperphagia, that which leads to obesity. Now, if there is stimulation of the satiative center and damage to the feeding center causes hypophagia or even aphasia. So, regulation of the food intake is done by hypothalamus. There is a feeding center and a satiative center. Which center is getting stimulated depends upon that. The person may feel hungry, hyperphagia or aphagia or even hypophagia. Now, there is a drinking center is also situated in the lateral part of the hypothalamus. So, this also controls how much thirst the person is. So, hypothalamus regulate the food and water intake also. So, it is the feeding center is placed on the lateral side of the hypothalamus, and the satiative center is placed on the medial side of the hypothalamus. Again, drinking center is on the lateral part of the hypothalamus. So, that this is the method how this is the regulation of the food and water intake. Now, it is having control on sexual and reproduction activities. So, we already discussed it produces some releasing hormone and inhibiting hormone. So, there is a gonadotropin, it produces gonadotropin releasing hormone, and it controls the through anterior pituitary, it controls the gametogenesis. It controls the various reproductive cycles, and it produces maturation and maintenance of secondary sexual characters. Now, another function of hypothalamus is that it controls the biological clock. There is a rhythm in the body, there is a biological clock in the body, and hypothalamus is the center which controls the biological clock. And next is emotion, fear, rage, pleasure, reward, punishment. All these are controlled by hypothalamus along with the limbic system and prefrontal cortex. So, we were discussing about the functions of hypothalamus. It produces growth hormone, releasing hormone. It is having an endocrine control that is, it controls the anterior pituitary, producing growth hormone, releasing hormone, thyrotropin releasing hormone, then gonadotropin releasing hormone, somatostatin and prolactin inhibiting hormone. Then it secretes or it produces oxytocin and vasopressin. So, it can be considered as the mediator or chief part of the autonomic activity, and it regulates the temperature. It regulates the food and water intake, and it is having an active role in sexual and reproductive activities. It controls the biological clock, and along with the limbic system and prefrontal cortex, it controls the emotion, fear, rage, pleasure, reward, punishment, etc. Now, in case of lesion, any injury or any lesions of the hypothalamus, so it causes obesity, there is chance of obesity, diabetes insipidus, epilepsy, sexual disturbances. There may be disturbance in the sleep or disturbance in the biological clock. There may be chance of hyperglycemia and even glucosuria. So any of the symptoms depends upon which part is affected or depends upon how much it is affected. Any of the symptom may present. So there may be obesity, chance of obesity, diabetes insipidus, epilepsy may be the sexual disturbances, may be the disturbance of sleep and biological clock may be there. There may be chance of hyperglycemia and glucosuria. Next important structure in the brain is the basal ganglia. Basal ganglia is considered as it is a subcortical intracerebral mass gray matter forming an important part of the extrapyramidal system. Basal ganglia is having mainly 4 parts. There is a corpus striatum, there is amygdaloid body, there is a claustrum and caudate. These are the different 4 parts of the basal ganglia. Corpus striatum, amygdaloid body, claustrum and caudate are the 4 different parts of the basal ganglia. Now, what are the functions of basal ganglia? So, it is necessary for normal tone and posture, and it is needed for all voluntary and associated movements, and it is associated as its main function is initiation of voluntary movement, and it inhibits the appearance of static tremor. So, any lesions of the this basal ganglia causes, that is, it will affect the tone and posture, and it will affect the movement, especially the initiation of movement, and it causes tremor, static tremor. So, main functions of basal ganglia are it is necessary for normal degree of tone and posture, and it is needed for voluntary movement, that is starting or especially associated as well initiation, especially initiation of voluntary movement and associated movements, and it inhibits the appearance of static tremor. Now, there may be chance of damage to this basal ganglia, and the damage or lesions of the basal ganglia is known as Parkinsonism or Parkinson's syndrome. The causes may be idiopathic or a Wilson's disease, which is there will be associated liver diseases also. A viral infection of the brain may get affected the basal ganglia, or a direct trauma or a traumatic brain injury. Even there are drug-induced lesions are also there. So, the causes may be an idiopathic without any cause, or a Wilson's disease, a viral disease, or a drug-induced basal ganglia lesion, or even a direct trauma may cause the lesions of the basal ganglia. Now, we already discussed that the functions of basal ganglia is mainly controls the normal degree and tone, and it inhibits the chance of appearance of tremors, and it is one of the main area which controls the proper movement. Now, absence of any lesions of this basal ganglia causes affect all these functions. So, the signs and symptoms of Parkinsonism is, the first one is rigidity. Rigidity, the type of rigidity seen in Parkinsonism are lead pipe rigidity and cogwheel type of rigidity. Leg pipe rigidity means that there will be rigidity throughout the movement, and cogwheel rigidity is a jerking type of movement will be available. So, there will be rigidity at intervals. Now, tremors. There will be the function of basal ganglia is inhibition of tremors. Now, the lesions of the basal ganglia can cause tremors. So, the tremors is usually resting type of tremors. Resting tremors can be seen. Now, hypokinesia or akinesia may be seen. That is, there is decreased movement, because basal ganglia is a structure which controls the movement. So, especially the voluntary movement. So, it causes a decrease in the movement or even difficult to start the movement. Then the muscles may be affected. The muscles, there will be the movements of the muscle will be affected. Even the facial muscles will get affected. It causes an expressionless face, and that is the expressionless face, and the face is known as masses facies. And there will be chance of chorias, and there will be athetosis, and Pill rolling tremor may be the tremor. The type of tremor is resting tremor or pill rolling type of tremors you can see. And gait also will get affected. The name of the gait is called fascinating gait. The subjects will walk like he is as if he is going to catch the center of gravity, and there will be short fast steps will be there. So once we go through the signs and symptoms of Parkinsonism, there will be cogwheel or lead pipe of rigidity, there will be resting tremor, there will be hypokinesia or akinesia, there will be masses facies, and there will be fascinating gait, chorea and athetosis. These are the major signs and symptoms of Parkinsonism. Next structure is the internal capsule. Internal capsule is a V-shaped structure. It's a large band of fibers situated in the inframedial part of the cerebral hemisphere. Now, internal capsule contains the fibers coming and going out of the cortex. Now, we can compare this internal capsule. There are lots of fibers. It contains lots of fibers going out and coming from the cerebral cortex. So, it can be compared as a narrow gate where the fibers are densely crowded. So, as almost all the fibers or important fibers passing through this internal capsule, a small damage in the internal capsule can cause a wide spread of dearrangement. So, internal capsule is a V-shaped area which contain lots of fibers which going to and coming back from the cerebral cortex. So, even a small lesions of the cerebral cortex causes wide spread of dearrangement. Now, one of the most important part of the cerebrum, it's the cerebral cortex itself. Now, once we see anatomically the cerebral cortex can be divided into 4 areas. Anatomically, the cerebral cortex can be divided into 4 areas, that is frontal, parietal, temporal and occipital lobes. So, cerebral cortex can be divided into frontal, parietal, temporal and occipital lobes. Now, Brodmann have divided the cerebral cortex into 47 areas, different areas for different functions. So, some major areas are motor area is area 4. There is a premotor area, that is area 6. There is frontal eye field, area 8. Prefrontal area, that is area 9, 10, 11, 12. There is Broca's area, it is also called speech area, that is area 44. These are some major areas, and we already discussed, that is Brodmann divided the cerebral cortex into different areas. Then we already discussed how the lobes are, how the cerebrum is divided into different lobes, and the frontal lobe mainly controls the voluntary control of the skeletal muscle is at the frontal lobe. Motivation, aggression, mood is also controlled. Then planning, social judgment, intelligence, everything is controlled by the frontal area. Then parietal area is the major center for reception and evaluation of most of the sensory information, but it excludes smell, hearing and vision. And it's the taste, touch, pressure, temperature and pain is already the reception and evaluation of most of these sensory information like taste, touch, pressure, temperature and pain is at the parietal lobe. But smell, hearing and vision are not there. That is especially the special senses. 3 important special senses are not there in the parietal lobe. Occipital lobe is the area where it receive and evaluate the vision, and temporal lobe is the area which evaluate the smell and hearing, and then memory and visual recognition and emotions are controlled by the temporal area. So, again the parts that frontal area mainly the voluntary control of the skeletal muscles and its intelligence, motivation, social judgment, aggression, planning, mood, etc. is controlled by the frontal area. Then parietal area, especially these are the sensory areas, especially it receives the sensation like taste, touch, pressure, temperature, pain, but occipital area is for vision and temporal area is for smell and hearing, especially The memory, visual recognition and emotional behavior is at temporal area. Now there is a small part called insula. Insula is a part of the limbic system. It plays a role in understanding the spoken languages, taste, and integrating sensory information from visceral receptors. So motor areas of frontal lobes are the primary motor cortex are there, premotor cortex are there, Broca's area is there. So the motor cortex consists of the primary motor cortex. It controls the voluntary contraction of the skeletal muscle, and it contains the pyramidal cells, which is the origin of the pyramidal tract. So cerebrum consists of the motor area, especially the frontal lobe consists of the motor areas. It contains the primary motor cortex. It controls especially the voluntary contraction of the skeletal muscle cells, and it contains the pyramidal cells, which is the origin of the pyramidal tract. Then it contains the premotor cortex. It contains especially the extrapyramidal tracts, and its main function is the coordination of the movements in a sequence. And much of the next area is the Broca's area. Broca's area especially it controls the speech. Now cerebrum contains the sensory areas. The main sensory area is primary sensory cortex. It is seen at the parietal lobe. Especially its main function is it controls the touch, pressure, temperature and pain. Now there is a visual cortex is there. It's seen at the occipital lobe. There is an auditory cortex. It is at the temporal lobe. There is a olfactory cortex. It is again seen at the temporal lobe, and there is a gustatory cortex. It is at the insula and frontal lobe. So cerebrum consists of the motor area. Motor area consists of primary motor cortex, premotor cortex and Broca's area. The sensory area consists of the primary sensory cortex, which is seen at the parietal lobe, visual cortex, which is seen at the occipital lobe, or auditory cortex, which is seen at the temporal lobe, and olfactory cortex also seen at the temporal lobe, and gustatory cortex, it is seen at the insula and frontal lobe. Now there is another system called the limbic system. Its main function is its emotions. It establishes emotional state. So it links the consciousness, intellectual functions of the cerebral cortex with autonomic functions of the brainstem. It facilitates the memory storage and retrieval. It makes you want to do a complex task. Its limbic system can also be called as motivational system. So this session we discussed about the anatomy of the brain. So we'll go through this. We'll go through what are the things we studied already. So we divided the brain into two hemispheres, a cerebral and two hemispheres, and there is a two cerebellar hemispheres are also there, and there is a brainstem. So cerebral part is there. Brain consists of a cerebrum, cerebellum, and brainstem, which contain the midbrain, pons and medulla. Then cerebrum again we divide into different lobes, and midbrain the brainstem can be divided into midbrain, pons and medulla. Then we studied about the cerebellum, its functions of the cerebellum, and its main and what will happen once there is a lesions to the cerebellum. There will be chance of tremors, there will be dysarthria, there will be nystagmus, there will be dysdiadokinesia, and different types of hypotonia, and posture also will get affected. Then thalamus, main function, we studied about the thalamus and its function, hypothalamus and its functions like endocrine control, its secretion, its autonomic effects. It's a center of the autonomous nervous system. We discussed about the temperature regulations of the hypothalamus. Then we discussed about the basal ganglia and how that is injury to the basal ganglia may cause the disease called the syndrome called Parkinson's syndrome, and internal capsule, which is the major part where the fibers are passing through, and we discussed about the cerebral cortex. It can be divided into 4 lobes, and we can divide it into different areas, and we discussed about the which are the different motor areas and sensory areas, and that's all about the brain. And there are some references, you can go through the references which will help you to study more and understand more. Thank you.